Open to Psalm 107. Psalm 107, that's where we'll read this morning. This morning's scripture text holds some special meaning for me because for about 3 years now, my wife, Candace, has been telling me that I need to preach a sermon on Psalm 107. I'm not joking. About 3 years ago, she said, man, Psalm 107, it's just the best. You got to read it. I said, okay, I'll read through it. And man, that is a good psalm. She said, you got to preach on this psalm. And I said, okay, I will one day. So here we are in a series on the Psalms. And Psalm 107 opens book 5 of the book of Psalms. And it begins like this. Verse 1, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. If that sounds familiar, it's a refrain that you'll see often in book 5 of the Psalms, and so it's appropriate that it begins the book. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. And there's something about that draws us in as we lean in to hear what that story is. We just get a hint, really, that these people have been through something, that they have been in the hand of the foe, that they have been scattered. And for the redeemed to tell that story, in this case, it means looking back at what is probably the darkest period in Jewish history, the period of the exile. I mean, to tell the story of how God gathered from the four corners of the earth, his people, you have to remember and look back at how they were scattered to the four winds. After Jerusalem had been destroyed, after their homes had been burned and families torn apart. So some were taken prisoner and some were scattered to other places and some wandered aimlessly. And yet, if you're going to tell that story, you do have to include all those dark moments of exile. But in the midst of all of these different situations where God's people were scattered, God's love really did endure forever. God was never too distant to provide rescue. God was protecting and delivering and providing for his people the entire time, right up until the point where he brought them back. And now looking back, the psalmist says, how can we not tell that story? You know, if you were here last week, when Cam Reynolds, our discipleship and connections pastor, preached last Sunday, he told the story of their house fire this summer. And one of the things he said was, this is just part of our story now. It's part of our story. There are moments of loss and trial and tragedy, and maybe you've said that before where you've been through something and now you just say, this is part of my story now. You probably experienced those things where someone says, tell your story. You can't tell your story without those moments. Moments of darkness, moments of tragedy, moments of hurt, because they have so shaped your life. And yet the psalmist is inviting the people of Israel and inviting us, in whatever way you tell your story, to tell it as a story of darkness that has been redeemed by God, the God who creates light out of darkness. To see and to give thanks for God's provision and God's presence and God's protection through it all. And as we read through this psalm, we get 4 different stories of God's rescue. We do get some stories. There's a kind of cycle that really repeats in each story. You know, people cry out to God and God delivers them. And that repeats 4 different times, with the lost who are rescued from wandering, and the prisoners who are delivered from prison, and the sick who are restored to health, and then the storm-tossed who are saved from the storm. It's almost like a song, really, that has different verses, but then the same chorus. You know, different situations of trouble and helplessness, but the same chorus is repeated. They cried out, he delivered them, let them give thanks for his unfailing love. And the way it's all arranged is really beautiful because it's like everyone's story is different, And yet, everyone's story is the same. And then at the end, there's a twist that sort of makes you go back and put it all together, probably in a way that you didn't expect at first. So let's read the first story of deliverance here in verse 4. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. That's the situation, and here's what they did. Verse 6, then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. That line will be repeated again and again. Verse 7, he led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. So the lost are rescued. And if you think about this, being lost is not just like you're being lost in a car somewhere and you need directions. This is like lost in the desert, or, think about being lost in the woods and you're running out of food and water and you're hungry and thirsty and lost and exhausted and there's really nothing you can do. And this is a picture of aimlessness and wandering. And so they cry out to God for rescue. And God brings about, we get the situation, and then we get God's reversal of the situation, his rescue. The reversal here is that he brought them to a city, and he gave them a home, and he satisfied the thirsty and filled the hungry with good things. And so in each scene, we're going to see the situation, and then we'll see this kind of reversal happen. So let's look at the rest of the scenes, and we'll kind of roll through these more quickly. There's some repetition, as you'll see. So verse 10, some sat in darkness, in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains. So we're no longer lost in the desert. We're now in a dark prison. Suffering in iron chains because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. In this case, the trouble is their own fault, seems like. Okay, that's how the second and third scenes are pictured. The trouble is the consequence of some sin and rebellion against God. Verse 12, so he subjected them to bitter labor, and they stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he breaks down gates of bronze and cuts through bars of iron. Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. This seems to be speaking about sickness or illness. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. And then again we repeat, let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell his works with songs of joy. And then the final story, verse 23. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants in the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. And in their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. That is where this phrase comes from, by the way. It says their wisdom is swallowed up. And so the King James translators translated it at their wits' end, and that's where our phrase comes from. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They grew glad when it was calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. And then the refrain, let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. What all these scenes have in common is the helplessness of humanity. And God meeting humanity in its helplessness and enacting some reversal, some rescue. That's the picture that we get. When you're lost in the woods without a compass, with no map, that's a picture of helplessness. Your only hope is to call for help. When you're trapped in prison with no escape, that's a picture of helplessness. You can't get yourself out of the prison. You need someone to rescue you. Or when you're sick, weak, and exhausted, you know the feeling of like utter helplessness, you know? You need someone to tend or to care, to restore your health, to help you, to heal you. Or when you're in the middle of the ocean in a storm, you're helpless. You can't do anything. There are all these pictures of helplessness. And the thing is, when you think about the situations individually, they were probably real situations, right? Did God deliver the people in the midst of these situations in exile? Well, yes, he probably did. God did actually provide places for the people to live so that they wouldn't wander aimlessly. And some of them were prisoners who had been set free. And some of them most certainly had been near death, close to death, or in mortal danger, and yet God had preserved many of them and brought them back into the land. So God had rescued them in specific ways. But when you take all these scenes together, there's obviously more than just the individual scenes where if God helped you in a storm, then you should give thanks. No. There's some kind of pattern that the psalm wants us to see where we all give thanks, regardless of whether God rescued us in that specific situation. He wants to see this overarching pattern and respond to it with thanksgiving. And the pattern is that God's overwhelming response to the helplessness of humanity is love. God's love is demonstrated and shown most clearly in his rescue of those who are absolutely helpless. Over and over again, it says, give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. The love and the deeds go together. Okay, God's unfailing love and his wonderful deeds, they go hand in hand. God has God's wonderful deeds when he brings aid to the lost or brings freedom to the trapped or brings peace in the storm or healing to the sick. Those deeds demonstrate God's unfailing love, and vice versa. The unfailing love is the reason for the action on behalf of humanity. So the love motivates the deeds demonstrate the love. Okay, that means that God is not responding here to the worthiness of humanity. Nowhere in this psalm is God's love tied to the worthiness of the people who need to be saved. God's love is not motivated by the worthiness of the people. There is no mention that the people who cry out to God are particularly righteous. It doesn't say that God saves those who are upright in heart or that hope in him. I mean, in fact, in some cases, it says they have not been particularly righteous. Being particularly righteous was not a criteria for God to help them. Being helpless was the criteria for God to help them. These people, in many ways, have failed to follow God's ways. They're reaping the consequences of that in the exile. That's why the people were in the exile in the first place, because they had not followed God's way for them, but had rebelled against God. So some of this was of their own making. So there's kind of more to this pattern than you first thought, because it's not just God demonstrating his love in the midst of helplessness and enacting a reversal. The people had actually run away from God, who is their only help, and now are crying out in their helplessness. So some of it is their fault. It's like a child who runs away from home, is utterly helpless, and then a few miles down the road, calls collect back home and says, I need help. Well, duh, you ran away from the people who will help you. And so now this is your situation. God allowed them to run away, allowed them to rebel and reap the consequences. And then his love was demonstrated over and over again in their helplessness, regardless of whether they were worthy or not. And at the end of the psalmist kind of takes you back through the pattern, only this time you see it a little differently. You see that the reversal that God brings from the rescue, the reversal can go the other way too. Listen to verse 33. He turned rivers into a desert, flowing springs into thirsty ground, and fruitful land into a salt waste because of the wickedness of those who lived there. Okay, so God, in response to helplessness, can provide rescue, but in response to evil and wickedness, might turn a fruitful land into a wilderness. That's a reversal, but it's in the opposite direction of rescue. Now listen to verse 35. It changes direction again. Verse 35, he turned the desert into pools of water and the parched ground into flowing springs. There he brought the hungry to live, and they founded a city where they could settle. So this is the reverse again. Instead of God responding to evil and wickedness by turning fruitful land into a wilderness, God is making a desert into a spring for those who are needy or helpless or hungry. Now listen what happens. What happens to those people that God brought into the land and helped? Well, verse 37, they sowed fields and planted vineyards that yielded a fruitful harvest. He blessed them, and their numbers greatly increased, and he did not let their herds diminish. And you can almost finish the story here. God helped the people, brought them into a land, and eventually, what happens to those people? They forget. They forget that God brought them into the land. They forget that God rescued them. They forget that God put them into this position in a nice land. And then what happens? Well, then, verse 39, their numbers decreased, and they were humbled by oppression, calamity, and sorrow. He who pours contempt on nobles made them wander in a trackless waste. So here we are again. The needy and helpless, they were brought into a good land, blessed, but then there's oppression, and the nobles are made to wander. What had happened? Well, they forgot God. They fell into oppression, calamity, sorrow. And then God made them wander. And then what happens again? At the end of the pattern, verse 41, but he lifted the needy out of their affliction and increased their families like flocks. No matter how many times the pattern repeats, God will always help the helpless. So the upright see and rejoice, verse 42, but all the wicked shut their mouths. God brings reversal and reversal again and then reversal again. And the whole point of this closing section is to say to all these Israelites who have been rescued and restored to their land, don't forget. Give thanks, give thanks, give thanks, give thanks, and don't forget to give thanks. Take note of how quickly and easily God can reverse the situation. Just like God had already done in the history of the people of Israel. God had already done this several times. I mean, the Egyptians were judged for their wickedness. God brought them out of Egypt, saved them, gave them the promised land, right? And then blessed them. But then they themselves turned away and were exiled because of their wickedness. But then in their helplessness in exile, God has lifted them up again. So God has the power to enact the reversals. And the upright see this and rejoice because God can always exalt the lowly. The wicked, those who are opposed to God, they're silent. They shut their mouths because God can humble the proud. It's as if the psalm is saying, don't become proud in your position. Don't forget, thinking that it's because of your worthiness that God has brought you into your position. It's not because of your worthiness. It is on account of his unfailing love. That is why you are in the place you are in. It's because of God's love. And yet, no matter how many times the pattern repeats, it always ends with God's willingness to rescue the helpless again. And so let the one who is wise, that's how this psalm ends. Let the one who is wise, verse 43, heed these things and do what? Ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. Consider, think about, ponder. Wisdom. That's where this psalm ends. You think it's going to end with thanksgiving because it begins with thanksgiving, but no, it ends with wisdom. Let the one who is wise heed these things. Pay attention to this. It would be unwise, in other words, to look out into the world and observe in the world all the illness and the catastrophe, the aimlessness, the lostness, the loneliness, and the chaos of all of that, which is what we saw in these four, vignettes, these four stories in this psalm. It would be unwise to look out into the world at all of that chaos and interpret that as evidence of a lack of God's love. That is not evidence of a lack of God's love. That is evidence of humanity's utter helplessness. That's what the chaos in the world is evidence of, our helplessness. not a lack of God's love. Those things are the truest index of our actual situation. We're helpless without God in the world. And could it be that God allows situations of helplessness for the very purpose that humanity might cry out to God and find that his love endures forever? Perhaps there's wisdom in remembering that the chaos of life is not an example of the absence of God. It is the stage on which the drama of God's love is demonstrated. Because don't forget that everywhere you turn, the chaos and the illness and all of these things are actually causing people to draw near to God and discover more of his love. Illness all the time makes people cry out to God. Come back to God. Plead with God. Seek God's help. Is every illness healed when someone calls out to God? No. This psalm gives us the impression that God is healing and rescuing left and right. And indeed, I think if our eyes were open to it, you would probably see that he is. And I think this psalm is challenging us to acknowledge that many, many people who do call out to God are rescued and are healed. And no one who is healed or rescued or delivered is healed or rescued or delivered apart from the love of God. However, we do know that sometimes God doesn't heal or spare us from tragedy. And these moments, those are the moments when the question is valid, where is God's unfailing love in those moments? And the answer is the cross. That God's unfailing love was so demonstrated in Jesus Christ's rescue enacted on the cross for the sake of helpless sinners, that's you and me, that now we never have to doubt God's love for us, even when God doesn't heal or spare us from tragedy. We never have to doubt God's unfailing love because of the cross. He's enacted the rescue for the helpless. So now we never have to doubt his love. When you see that God's love for us is demonstrated so clearly in his rescue of those who are helpless, you see this psalm leads us to none other than Jesus Christ. It's all through the psalm. Consider what Jesus claimed to be for those who were lost. I am the way. For those who were hungry, I'm the bread of life. For those who are thirsty, I will give you living water. For those who are exhausted, come to me, ye who are weary. What about for those who are in prison, in utter darkness? Jesus said, I've come to set the captives free. For those in darkness, I am the light of the world. To the sick, Jesus brought healing. For the disciples storm-tossed in the boat, Jesus stilled the storm. Let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. Wisdom is seeing that in all of our helplessness, Jesus is the very person of God who has come to meet us in our helplessness, in every way imaginable, to rescue, deliver, heal, save all who cry out to him, not just from this or that trouble, but from sin and judgment. Our stories are all different, and yet they are all the same. We're all helpless. We're all in need of saving. And God's love has come to meet us in Jesus Christ. But God's love is not just some affection or emotion. It's demonstrated in deeds of rescue and power. That's what Paul says in Romans 5. While we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. While we were still helpless, without any way to save ourselves. We are like those who are in prison, in chains of our own making, because we have rebelled against God. Let me tell you, there is no chance of you talking your way into heaven. That's not how this works. Or weighing the good, bads, and good and bad deeds in the scale. That's not how this works. We are like prisoners whose chains are made up of our own sins. You know, our pride at thinking we know better than God, or our hatefulness towards others, or our self-righteousness at thinking we're better than others. Our sins form all the links in the chains that bind us, and you can't break free of that because you can't undo your own sins. And nobody can, because everybody else is just as shackled as you are. But Jesus can, because he's not imprisoned by sin. He came to take the shackles on himself and die the death that we deserved. And when Jesus rose from the tomb on the third day, his resurrection sealed our rescue. See, the cross broke the shackles of sin. The resurrection broke the shackles of death for all who would call upon him. And maybe you didn't know that you were helpless. Maybe that's news. Or maybe you do know you're helpless. I don't know what situation you're in. But you are. And if you approach Jesus in your helplessness, in your poverty, knowing that you have nothing to bring to him, knowing you need rescue, then you will find forgiveness and love and redemption. But, anytime we approach Jesus in our sufficiency, or approach him with your desire to still have control over your life, or approach him in your self-righteousness, and beware, God might enact a reversal in your circumstances, because he can turn rivers into desert. Why? Because he wants us to learn his love and his power through the very experiences of helplessness. Because the truth is, we are helpless, and we desperately need him. We not only need him to rescue us from sin, we need him every day, daily. We can't live the Christian life without him. Many of us, we've spent so many years developing expertise in the ways of faith, but growing in the faith is good, but never outgrow your need for God's help and God's grace. Never outgrow your need for that. You're still helpless. You need him every day. If you're wandering, seek his wisdom and direction. If you're weary, seek his rest. If you're storm-tossed, seek him as your refuge. What is it? That is the point of the storm and the weariness after all. That's the whole point of it. This psalm's not trying to give us an explanation for it all. It's trying to give us wisdom. And there is wisdom in seeing that the whole point of the drama is to reveal and showcase and put on display the steadfast love of the Lord. That's the whole point of it. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. There'd be some good stories in this room. Be some hard stories too. But they would all showcase the love of God, because every part of the story is for the sake of our coming to know him and his love. See, if you miss that the story is supposed to lead you to his love all along, if you miss that, you kind of miss the point of the struggle and the deliverance from it. God help us all. He has. He will. God will help us because we're helpless. So give thanks for his unfailing love and his marvelous deeds for mankind. Let's pray.